Okay, here we go. It's great to see everybody here this evening for our Zoom program. I'm really looking forward to sharing the history of the 1955 flood in Torrington with you. But I always like to start my programs with a little perspective. And I'd like to tell you that the flood took place here in Torrington just 10 years after the end of World War II and 2 years after the end of the Korean War. Torrington's industries and its thousands of factory workers were still the arsenal of democracy and the mainstay of the local economy. Furthermore, the community was conditioned by world events to work together for a common cause. Torrington's community spirit was tested by the flood of 55, but the residents of Torrington showed their humanity and their grit by helping each other through some very tough times and working together to put the city back on its feet. The flood of 55 was certainly a tragedy, but it's also the story of heroism and humanity. Before I dig into this complex history, I want to remind you that the Historical Society is only able to collect Torrington's history and present programs such as this because of financial support that we receive from our members and friends. So if you're not a member, you can join through our website, or if you would just like to make a contribution, that can be done through our website as well. Or we still accept old-fashioned checks. Many of you may have personal stories about the flood to share, and I'm sorry that we won't have time to listen to those tonight. We'll only have time for a few questions after the presentation, but we hope to plan a special Zoom program in the future that will allow you to share your personal stories of the flood of 55, and we can record them at the same time. The oil painting that you're looking at on the screen was painted by Arthur Covey of Harwinton. He donated this painting to the Historical Society. It's his vision of the flood in Torrington. It's a composite view of some of the events that took place here in town. Covey's best known for his John Brown murals at the Torrington Post Office, but we are really pleased to have this painting of the flood in our permanent collection. There's a couple scenes that you see in this painting that will be more familiar to you after the program tonight, specifically the two houses that are leaning together, the top left part of the painting, and the lumber that you can see all piled up in the bottom left-hand side of the painting. This program relies almost exclusively on photographic images in the collection of the Historical Society. Both amateurs and professional photographers documented the flood and its aftermath, and we are grateful for their photographic work and their donations to the museum. Many of the images that you see tonight were taken by professional photographer James Miller, a World War II veteran and POW who opened a photo studio in Torrington when he returned home. In 1970, Jim helped start an organization called Pride. It was the first environmental organization in Connecticut dedicated to cleaning up one of the state's rivers. Jim not only documented the flood, but he was especially skilled at covering the human interest side of the story, particularly the relief and recovery work. Bear with me for a moment. I want to minimize the video panel. I'm going to begin with a map that shows the Naugatuck River watershed in Torrington, because it's impossible to really understand the flood without some knowledge of the watershed. The Naugatuck River watershed covers about the western 2/3 of Torrington, as you can see from this map. The eastern third of Torrington is a watershed that flows to the east and is part of the Farmington River watershed. So although that contributed to the flood of 55 in other areas, it didn't contribute so much to Torrington, except in the Burville section. So the east branch of the river, the flows of the Naugatuck River, starts north of town in Winchester and flows down the Newfield Road. I'm trying to get my cursor on here so you can see it. Flows down the Newfield Road, crosses Main Street in the north end, crosses East Main Street, and joins the west branch of the river just below Fusenich Park. The west branch of the river starts in Norfolk and Goshen and flows down the Norfolk Road through Brass Mill Dam, through West Torrington, and then flows along Riverside Avenue. It crosses Main Street at Center Bridge and again joins the east branch of the river just below Fusenich Park. This 1870 map of Torrington is illustrative of the, I'm sorry, go back to this again here. This 1870 map of Torrington is illustrative of the industry that was established along the river, and also paints a better picture of the watershed through Torrington. You can see the west branch starts in the upper right-hand corner of the image and flows south through the lower left-hand corner of the image. The east branch starts in the mid-right side of the image and flows toward the west branch. They join at a point that's just out of our view on this map. Starting at the top of the view, you will see some features that we'll talk about tonight. The Brass Mill Dam, the Church Street Bridge, the Co-Brass Company, which by the time of the flood was the American Brass Company, the Hotchkiss Brothers Company, the Railroad Bridge, the Prospect Street Bridge right here, the Main Street Bridge, and then Center Square and Franklin Street. The 55 flood was not the first big flood in Torrington. There were probably floods in Torrington for thousands of years that went unrecorded. But the first big flood that was well recorded was June 28, 1869. And it was the first to be documented in pictures. And this flood had similar effects to the flood of 55. It washed out East Main Street, as in the flood of 55, and it also washed out North Main Street in the north end of Torrington. We know a little bit about the flood of 1869 from this journal that was kept by Charles McNeill, born in 1855, and he was 14 years old when he was writing in his journal about the big flood of 1869. And I want to show you an image next of the flood. This image shows the bridge in the center of Torrington, right here. Sorry. Here's the bridge. This is looking across the bridge toward Coe Park. At that time, Coe Park had the Coe House still standing on it. This is Litchfield Street over here. This is the Coe Furniture Company on the south bank of the river. And you can see a group of people gathered here surveying the aftermath of the flood. The flood ripped away half of the bridge in the center, coursed down East Main Street in this direction. This building here is kind of interesting. It survived the flood of 1869 and was still standing in 1955 when the 1955 flood hit. But that flood was too much for it, and it went down the river at that time. While this picture's up, I want to read a few words of Charles McNeill from his diary about this 1869 flood. June 28th, Monday, the great freshet. Freshet, by the way, was a term used in that time period to describe a flash flood. Commenced raining at 3 o'clock. The water rose so that it ran into our cellar above the windows. Persons that went across the street had to wade and hold onto a rope. Spoiled all the gardens. Roads all covered with rocks, poles, stumps, and ditches. Every bridge in town and every shop except one carried off. The big Brass Mill Dam gave way and washed the tracks so that the train cannot run up or down except from here to Litchfield Station. It was the largest freshet that was ever seen here. On June 29th, McNeill wrote, mud 3 inches thick all over everything. On July 1st, he wrote, worked all morning at throwing off stones from the sidewalk and did not work much in the afternoon as I was rather tired. On September 2nd, he wrote, almost finished the Main Street Bridge. That would be the new bridge that replaced the one damaged here in the photograph. This is a picture of Franklin Street that was taken about 1900, 1910. I believe it was taken in the springtime. As you can see, the leaves starting to come out on some of the trees, and the flow of water in the west branch of the river was kind of high at that time, not in flood stage, but rather high. And here's Center Bridge with stores. There were 4 stores located on Center Bridge at this point in time. It's a rather picturesque view of Franklin Street and the west branch of the Naugatuck River. Here's the same view during the summer of that year, and you can see that the foliage is on the trees, the water is considerably lower, and you can still see the bridge up here in the center of the photograph, right here. And here's a small dam that pooled the water up in the center. The next major flood in Torrington, there were minor ones between 1869 and 1938, but 1938 was the next major one. And it was caused by the Great Hurricane of September 21st, which made landfall in New Haven. It was the eastern part of Connecticut and Rhode Island that were hardest hit by the fierce winds of 160 miles an hour, Category 5 winds. Torrington experienced winds of about 80 to 100 miles an hour during the storm, but 6 inches of rain fell. And there had been 9 inches of rain just prior to that. So that was 15 inches of rain in a very short period of time. This is what East Main Street looked like during the flood of 1938. It was similar to this in 1955, except in 1955, the water was much higher. This is the East Albert Street Bridge crossing the Naugatuck River. Toward the south end of Torrington, below Fusenich Park. You can see in this photograph that the water is flowing over the bridge, but the bridge survived the flood. It was replaced later. Before 1955, it was replaced by a concrete bridge. About 10 years after the 38 hurricane, Torrington had Torrington picked itself up and cleaned itself out from the 38 hurricane pretty quickly. But this view shows the center of Torrington in 1948. And this building that you can see right in the center, it's labeled Donnie's Auto Service and Bus Terminal. This is the building that survived the 1869 flood, but in a few short years would be washed down the river in the flood of 1955. This aerial view of Torrington shows some of the features that we're going to be discussing when it comes to the flood of 55. It shows the brass mill casting shop in the upper part of the photograph, the Prospect Street Bridge, the Main Street Bridge. Just before 1955, you can see the bridge had stores on the west side and stores on the east side. There were 8 retail stores altogether on the bridge when the flood of 55 hit. This picture also shows the Workman Rollinson Furniture Company to the left of the center bridge. Sorry. The Howard's Building to the right of Center Bridge, and you can see Franklin Street right here. 1955 was a dry summer here in Torrington. So when Tropical Storm Connie, a downgraded hurricane, hit Torrington on August 8th through 11th, the people were rather pleased that they were getting some welcome moisture, welcome rain. 9 inches of rain fell during Tropical Storm Connie. And just 4 days later, the bands of former hurricane Tropical Storm Diane started to encroach upon Torrington. And the forecast that was published in the Torrington Register for August 18th and 19th of 1955 read, "Some rain likely." In reality, 14 inches of rain fell from the slow-moving Tropical Storm Diane. That fell on ground that was completely saturated from Tropical Storm Connie. So together, within the period of just a little over a week, 23 inches of rain fell on Torrington. And given the topography, with the steep hillsides all draining into the river valley, you can imagine what happened. The river valley collected all that water and funneled it south toward Long Island Sound. This is a map that shows the track of Hurricane Diane. It came ashore in North Carolina on August 17th. It was quickly downgraded to a tropical storm, but it carried a lot of rain and moved slowly up through Virginia and Pennsylvania and started spreading rain into Connecticut on the 18th. This picture shows some of the flooding that occurred in Torrington on August 18th, the day before the flood of 55. You can see that it was still a serious situation even before the heavy rains from Hurricane Diane hit. This chronology is helpful in understanding the flood. On August 18th, by 10:15 in the morning, a bridge had washed out on the Newfield Road. By 12 noon, the civil defense was placed on standby. And at 9 p.m. that evening, very heavy rains began to fall. And they continued overnight for the next 12 hours. And I've heard that it wasn't very windy during the storm, that the rain fell straight down and people were able to leave their windows open that night without it raining in. But it was extremely heavy. On August 19th, after the stroke of midnight, by 1 a.m., the National Guard was mobilized. Around 2 a.m. or so, two reservoirs on the West Branch broke their dams. One was Hatchaluchee and Goshen, and the other was Marshall Lake Dams. Together, they added about 10% to the already swollen West Branch of the river. Around 3 a.m., the last telephone call gets through to CLMP in Hartford. And this is what they said: all hell has broken loose. At 3:12, 12 minutes later, the lights went out. By 12:30 the next morning, the rain had stopped. But in between 3:12 and 10:30 the next morning, a heck of a lot of damage was done. Jim Miller grabbed his camera at first light and struck out to take some pictures of what was happening. He took this picture from the bank of the river behind Water Street, looking down toward Center Bridge. And believe you me, you wouldn't want to fall into those angry waters. This shows the remains of Center Bridge, the Central Hotel, and the back of the Workman Rollinson Furniture Company. Jim turned around and shot this picture looking upstream. This shows the Prospect Street Bridge, water flowing over and around it. And it shows water coursing through the casting shop of the brass mill and coming out these second floor windows right here. Jim then went down to the corner of Water and Main Street and shot this poignant picture of a policeman staring out over the flooded center of Torrington. Mind you, this wasn't the crest of the flood. The crest of the flood occurred during the dark of night. The waters had already started to recede a little bit, but they were still creating severe havoc and damage in the center of town. Jim couldn't cross the river to take this picture, but another photographer snapped it from Coe Park, looking north across where the bridge used to be toward the Allen Building and the Warner Theater. The east and west branches of the river created a new confluence on East Main Street. The flooding waters from the West Branch met the flooding waters from the East Branch anywhere between St. Peter's Church and Wall Street. And I've been told that this was a very treacherous place to be during the flood. There were the currents from the two branches of the river meeting created some pretty dangerous whirlpools in this section of town. As the waters began to recede, more photographs were taken. This picture was taken from St. Peter's Church, looking across the street to Petricone's Pharmacy. And what's interesting about this picture is, well, not only the cars that floated perpendicular to the street, but you can actually see the high water mark on Petricone's Pharmacy right here. So it looks to me that the high water mark in this section of town was about 8 feet above ground level. Let's trace the flood down the two branches of the river and see what happened along the way. We're going to start with the east branch of the river up in Newfield. This is a picture of the Fedor farm which is where Sunnybrook Park is located today in Newfield. And you can see that even that far upstream, the flooding was very severe. It only got more intense as the river got closer to Torrington and picked up more water from other tributaries. By the time the east branch of the river got to the north end of Torrington at the Warrenton Woolen Mill, you can see from this photograph that it jumped its bank, jumped the retaining wall, and created a new river channel that was quite wide. Well, that river channel continued to grow and widen and eventually encompassed all of North Main Street, as you can see here. The Texaco gas station, by the way, that's about where CVS Pharmacy is today. And these buildings over here are about where the Torrington Savings Bank branch is in the north end. The waters continued down, crossing Route 4, flowing down Main Street, picking up more water from the East Branch as it crossed Main Street and flowed all the way down to where the Torrington Area Health District is located today. At that point, the floodwaters cut a new channel back to the East Branch, which was east of that point. This view of the north end shows a very wide river flowing through the north end. The river itself is actually behind these buildings over here. Behind this third house is where the river should be, but you can see it encompassed the entire north end. After the floodwaters receded, you could see the damage that was done to North Main Street. Again, this is where CVS is located today. This brick building was the Fitzgerald Manufacturing Company. It's where McDonald's is at present day. Let's go over to the west branch of the river for a moment. This is Marshall Lake, one of the reservoirs that suffered a breach in the dam. The other was Hatchaluchee, which is located in Goshen right here, and that water flowed down Nickel Mine Brook into West Torrington. This is the broken dam at Hatchaluchee as it looked after the 1955 flood. You can see it's quite high. Maybe it's a 20-foot high dam. So the amount of water impounded behind this was quite large. This is a view of the lake after it had drained and vegetation had started to grow again. So it's a sizable body of water that contributed to the flooding. So when the floodwaters moved down the West Branch and they were augmented by the water from Hatchaluchee and Marshall Lake, they slammed into West Torrington. This is the intersection of Riverside Avenue. The Esso station here is about where Frank's Pizza is located today. You can see on the left side of the photograph the bridge in West Torrington, which miraculously was saved during the flood. It didn't wash out, but the approaches to it were damaged, so it couldn't be used right away. This is a view of the bridge. You can see that it's washed out at the edge of the bridge. This is looking up the Goshen Road. Here's the First Congregational Church in the distance right here. These buildings right by the road sustained a lot of damage. The floodwaters continued downstream along Riverside Avenue. This picture shows the Union Hardware Company on the east side of the river. And the river itself is quite wide by this time. So wide that it encompassed this neighborhood by Dale Street and Lawn Street off of Riverside Avenue. And Riverside Avenue itself was a raging river during the flood of '55. This is one of my favorite objects in the collection of the Torrington Historical Society. It is, my friends, a genuine jar of silt recovered from the 1955 flood. This was recovered from the top of some cellar beams in a house on the corner of Riverside Avenue and Eggleston Street. My friend Bill Petroface salvaged this silt and donated it to the Historical Society. I've often wondered if we reconstituted that silt, if it would smell like the flood of '55. On Wolcott Avenue, the flood spared the Wolcott Avenue Bridge, but devastated the area all around that part of town. Normally, the river is about 10 yards wide at Wolcott Avenue and the Riverside Bridge, but in 1955, I have to believe it was at least 100 yards wide. It undermined these houses. This house, the White House in the foreground at 111 Wolcott Avenue, has an interesting tale, and I'll tell you part of it now, but I'll save the good part for last. So there is a two-family house. There was a family living on the first floor, 2 adults, 2 children, and a family living on the second floor, 2 adults and 3 children. The family on the second floor had just moved into that apartment on August 18th. August 19th was their first night in the house. Not a good night at all. As the floodwaters rose, the first floor tenants sought refuge with their new neighbors, the second floor tenants. So now there were 9 people in the second floor apartment. And as water began to enter the second floor, all 9 people sought refuge in the attic. And while they were in the attic, the house was undermined and shifted on its foundation and crashed into the house next door. And you can only imagine how frightening it must have been for those 9 people to be trapped in that dark attic, not knowing what was going on and fearing that their house could wash down the river at any minute. But there is a good ending, and more of that later. The floodwaters continued down along Riverside Avenue. Here they are flowing along and through Church Street, just before the Church Street Bridge. In the background, you can see some lumber piles. This was lumber stored by the Hotchkiss Brothers Company for use in their manufacturing plant, making wooden window sash and wooden blinds. You can see quite clearly on this lumber pile the high water mark from the floodwaters. The tragic thing was that there was a lot more lumber stored here before the flood. About 1 million board feet of thick, heavy pine planks washed down the river. And this would have a devastating effect on structures below. The first structure that the floodwaters and lumber encountered was the Church Street Bridge. And here's a picture of the water flowing over the remains of the Church Street Bridge and some of the damage done to the Hotchkiss Brothers Company along the river. This is a view of the remains of the Church Street Bridge after the floodwaters receded a bit. And this aerial view, again, shows the Church Street Bridge. This goes from the beginning of Midgeon Avenue across the river and then up to Highland Avenue. The floodwaters, with their million board feet of lumber and other debris, crashed into the American Brass Company, pictured here. The American Brass Company sustained more damage than any one industry in Torrington. $5 million in damage all told, which I think by today's standards, accounting for inflation, is about $55 million in damage. This building, pictured the top left, is still standing today. As a matter of fact, the river still flows under it. That building was built over the river, and there's a bridge right here, which I'll show you next. This bridge is the same bridge that one drives over today when entering the Stop and Shop parking lot from Water Street. So the bridge carries the river underneath it, and then it goes underneath the factory. A lot of the lumber from Hotchkiss Brothers ended up as a log jam in the river, and this created a problem because it dammed the river like a giant beaver dam, and it backed the water up into the brass mill, and it did a lot more damage at the brass mill than would have been done otherwise. Here's some of that lumber at the Prospect Street Bridge after the floodwaters receded. And guess what? We have a piece of that lumber in the collection of the Torrington Historical Society. When we did a flood exhibit several years ago, actually one of our many flood exhibits. A resident of Torrington donated this piece of lumber that was salvaged from the river during the flood, or after the flood of 55. A lot of the lumber and floodwaters, of course, continued downstream where they hit Center Bridge, knocking it off its foundation and washing it down the river. Along with it, they took the 4 stores on the west side of the bridge and the 4 retail stores on the east side of the bridge, and severely damaged the Central Hotel in the lower left here and the Workman Rollinson Furniture Company. When Center Bridge ripped away, it ripped away part of the Workman Rollinson Furniture Company with it. You can see the severe damage to this building. It was condemned and later demolished. This picture shows the Central Hotel and some of the damage done to it. It also shows the Workman Rollinson Furniture Company on the right edge of the screen. The floodwaters made it up Main Street about as far as the Warner Theater. However, you have to remember that the basements of all these buildings down here, the closer to the river you got, the deeper the water got, but also the basements of all these buildings were flooded, as well as parts of the first floor. The Warner Theater is kind of interesting because its auditorium goes below grade. In essence, it's a basement. And so the auditorium, I believe it was about half filled with water at the time of the 55 flood. This car that floated into the middle of Main Street, I think, was the most photographed automobile in Torrington's history. Here's the damage to the Central Hotel. There's a notation in the upper right-hand corner that says that the water was 5 feet on the ground and on the first floor of this building. This is another view looking downstream, showing the Central Hotel on the right. This large flat structure in the middle was the deck from Center Bridge. It's where it ended up after the flood. You can see the damage to the sewers and water lines, the pipes all lying jumbled here on the side of the river. And down here, you can see a building that's partially damaged. That's Frigo's House of Cheese. And it lost part of its side facing the river, but it was rebuilt. But I'm told that that hundreds of wheels of cheese washed out of that cheese shop and went down the river. Probably ended up in Long Island Sound. I know some of them ended up in Fusenage Park, and I've been told that some of the kids in Torrington used those wheels of cheese as baseball bases for a while after the flood. They probably couldn't do that too long, though. This is an aerial view of downtown Torrington on the afternoon of August 19th. The sun actually came out by the afternoon, and the river was still swollen with floodwaters, though. And you can see here the water still coursing down East Main Street and Franklin Streets, and Center Street as well over here. This is what East Main Street looked like at about that time. The water had receded a bit. It didn't fill the first floor of these buildings anymore, but it was still flowing pretty heavily down East Main Street. This aerial view shows the confluence of the west and east branches of the river. This is the west branch flowing south. This is the east branch flowing south, and they meet at a point right here, opposite Fusenage Park. There was a lot of damage in this area and several deaths. There were 2 deaths over here at the north end of Oak Avenue, and 1 death in the neighborhood just south of Coe Park, and more about that later. This neighborhood on the east side of South Main Street, adjacent to Fusenage Park, excuse me, was spared a lot of damage during the flood. And it was, although some buildings along the river were demolished, most of the neighborhood was intact and fully occupied in the late 50s and early 60s. This is the Park Place, Lipton Street neighborhood just south of Fusenage Park. Lipton Place is the street with 4 two-story houses on it. You can see them here, 1, 2, 3, 4. Before the flood, there were 5 houses here. There was a 5th right on the edge of the river. It was a house that was occupied by Anna and Ramilda Michelle. And during the flood of 55, they were rescued from their house by Ralph Sabia, his father, and his brother. And no doubt it saved their lives because that house went down the river. And I've been told that after the flood, that the lot where that house was swept clean. However, there was a teacup that belonged to the Michelles. It was the only thing sitting on that property after the house was washed away. This is a map that shows that neighborhood a little bit better. This is the Michelle house right next to the confluence of the east and west branches. The deaths on Oak Avenue took place right over here near the east branch of the river. This is the bridge the East Albert Street Bridge crossing the river, the same bridge that we saw in the hurricane of 38 photograph. And this is that same East Albert Street Bridge after the flood of 1955. You can see all the debris piled up here against the bridge. This next photo shows you the damage that the floodwater and debris did to this concrete bridge. You can see the middle of the bridge is undermined, the concrete is cracked, and this whole section of the bridge has sunk. This bridge was unsafe for traffic and had to be demolished, and a new one had to be built in its place. This map shows an area a little bit further south along the river. This is the Palmer Bridge Street. This is Perkins Street over here, the south end of Oak Avenue right here. This bridge was washed. This was an iron bridge. It was washed away in the flood. It ended up down by Iflin Lumber Company. There was a death in this neighborhood as well. Right here, Victor Quado lived in this house where my cursor is located. And I don't know the circumstances of his death, but that's where he lived and died. This house right here was occupied by Leo Zandi. It survived the flood, but he related that all during the night, lumber and debris from the flood kept hitting the house. Bang, 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 all night long. Again, it must have been a frightening night. This is what South Main Street looked like after the flood. The lumber here is a combination of lumber from Hotchkiss Brothers Company, house parts, and lumber from Iflin Lumber Company. These are the deaths that occurred in Torrington during the 1955 flood. And I just want to pay tribute to these people and mention their names and tell you about where they lived during the flood. Gustav Jacquemin lived on the Norfolk Road with his son in a log cabin. He was an invalid, and the cabin was washed down the river and he drowned. Lena Lemire lived further down the Norfolk Road, closer to the center of West Torrington. I don't know the circumstances of her death, but she was another casualty along the west branch of the river. Sorry. Carmela Rose Buccirio was a resident of 31 Oak Avenue. She and her daughter, Mary, were killed when the floodwaters slammed into their house at 31 Oak Avenue. Mrs. Armenia Zordon was drowned on Lipton Place. And her story was tragic because some people were attempting to rescue her. And in the process, she fell into the river and was swept away. And then Victor Quado, the resident of Scoville Street, and Mrs. Catherine Rawat, who actually lived on high ground at 131 French Street, but her car was caught in the floodwaters on South Main Street, and she was swept from the car and drowned. This is the funeral mass card for Carmela Balquiero and her daughter, Mary Balquiero. A tragic thing about their story is that they had just emigrated from Italy to Torrington 2 months before the flood. So the first responders worked during the night. A lot of the first responders were neighbors helping neighbors. In all told, 3,500 people were evacuated from flooding homes. The Public Works Department affected a lot of those rescues, especially in the Park Street and Park Place and Lipton Street neighborhood. The fire department was called out to rescue people at the Torrington Manufacturing Company. They were also called to a fire on East Pearl Street, and the fire truck got stranded in the floodwaters of the East Branch of the river. They never made it to the fire, but it was raining so hard that the rain put the fire out. Unfortunately, the firemen were trapped in their truck and they had to be rescued. They went, they got a rope attached to a nearby house and went hand over hand along the rope to the safety of that house. The police department, civil defense, and National Guard all took active parts in rescues that evening. There were 13 helicopters that were active in Torrington at the time of the flood. They were provided by the Army, Navy, and Sikorsky aircraft. I want to return to the story of the people that were trapped in the attic on Wolcott Avenue. Early in the morning of August 19th, one of the first floor tenants who was in the attic, Mr. D. Bernardin, swam through these floodwaters to solid ground and summoned help. And the Navy came with a helicopter to rescue the other 8 people that were still trapped in the attic. And one of the Navy crewmen came down a cable and got into the attic, and 1 or 2 people at a time rescued 5 people from the attic. However, the winds were picking up by this time, and they had to call off the rescue effort, leaving 3 people stranded in the attic. Not to worry, though, because as the waters receded, people were able to get a rope across to the house and to bring those last 3 people to safety through chin-high water. The second floor tenant, Mrs. Theophil, showed the pluck of everyone in Torrington when she said, "It was bad luck for us, but things will be all right again." The National Guard was active here at the time of the flood. There were several units, 2 from Connecticut, 1 from Ohio, and 1 from New York State. This is a National Guard truck on Riverside Avenue. And our 6 amphibious ducks came from Albany. This is one of them in Torrington at the time of the flood. The mayor, Mayor William T. Carroll, was out and amongst the people right away, helping to console them and see what the city could do to ease their plight. Here he is talking to Irving Strogatz, the owner of Howard's Company. Howard's had been closed for a period of time prior to the flood because they had expanded their inventory and remodeled and restocked the entire store. They were going to sell clothing, jewelry, in addition to the shoes that they had sold previously. And their grand opening for the new Howard store was set for the morning of August 19th, 1955. But the flood opened the store early. Waters of the West Branch came through the store about 8 feet deep, carrying debris with them and picking up more things from the store and smashing through the front door that you see here. All told, the store suffered $120,000 worth of damage, but they were determined, and over the course of the next weeks, they cleaned the store out, restocked, and reopened, and they were a successful shoe store on Main Street for many decades to follow. After the floodwaters receded, people started to come out to see what had happened. This photograph by Jim Miller is one of my favorites. It shows people, they seem to be stranded on an island by the brass mill casting shop. This is on the edge of the Prospect Street Bridge. You can see the bridge wasn't usable because of the huge washout. Some people from the south end got as far north as Coe Park, and here's the Civil War soldier atop the monument, keeping a grim outlook over the flood damage. If people could have got to the center square, this is what they would have seen. Mud, mud, mud. Some people called it the evil mud. Everybody I've talked to says that the mud was one of the worst aspects of the flood, because not only was it everywhere where the floodwaters coursed, it was on the first floors of buildings, it was in the basements, it was in the factories, it was in the streets, but it smelled too. And I don't know how bad it smelled, but from what people say, it was pretty foul. People from the north end came down Main Street as far as the Warner Theater to see the damage. And you can see the streets here at Maiden Lane and in front of the Mertz building are pretty clean. The water didn't make it that far. The only bridge in the downtown area that was passable was the railroad bridge. It was high above the floodwaters and it was not damaged. So the railroad bridge became the main conduit for people to travel from one side of the river to the other for several days until the Prospect Street Bridge could be repaired. This shows some of the cleanup, the mud being cleaned. It's been bulldozed into piles on South Main Street by Co Park. Gives you a good idea of the daunting task to clean up the streets. This was Franklin Street. The building is the offices of the Torrington Manufacturing Company. And you can see the street is full of a mix of rocks, lumber, and flood debris, including destroyed automobiles and trucks. This is East Main Street. After the cleanup had proceeded for a little bit, the streets have been scraped of the mud and look relatively normal. This is the area by Petrocone's Pharmacy. And again, even in this photograph taken several days after the flood, you can still see the high water mark on the side of the building. Around the street from Petrocone's is Center Street, and you can see that this was no calm flood event. The waters had a real angry flow to them, and they undermined these porches on Center Street and collapsed all these porches. They piled a bunch of debris up here in front of the third house in. So just to give credit to some of the relief workers, the Red Cross helped coordinate housing. The Salvation Army served 3,000 meals a day for several days, both to people at City Hall and to relief workers in the field. The Civil Defense worked with the Red Cross to provide housing and food for people. A lot of the people, though, that needed housing were taken in by relatives and neighbors. So again, it was neighbor helping neighbor. The Army Corps of Engineers were responsible for the restoration of vital services. They built 3 temporary Bailey bridges on Main Street, at the Church Street River Crossing, and at Palmer Bridge Street. And the health department vaccinated 20,000 people for typhoid. These vaccinations were done at the schools in Torrington, and the typhoid vaccine regimen was 1 shot a week for 3 weeks. So it was pretty rigorous. I've also recently read that parts of Torrington were dusted with DDT following the flood of '55. Here's a civil defense pass in our collection from the flood. It did not permit travel in restricted areas. Here's the police chief and some civil defense workers plotting a strategy. Here's a Red Cross worker interviewing an elderly gentleman whose house was damaged by the flood, probably assessing his needs and how the Red Cross could help. These pictures, by the way, of all the relief work were taken by Jim Miller. As I said, it's one of the strengths of his photography. Here's the 2 Salvation Army workers conferring at a lunch table at City Hall. And here's the food line at City Hall. And I absolutely love this picture, but as you can see, people cleaned out their basements with their canned goods and donated them to the relief efforts, and they were served at City Hall. Here's a tired civil defense worker grabbing a quick bite to eat, and another picture by Jim Miller showing a more weary civil defense worker catching a little bit of sleep on a cot at City Hall. The first issue of the paper was published on August 26th, the week after the flood. Helicopters continued to be active in the city, bringing in relief supplies, evacuating wounded people, and bringing in also water and the vaccines for typhoid. This is a picture of one of the typhoid clinics at one of the schools in Torrington. It's ironic that a water event, the flood of '55, resulted in a shortage of water in Torrington. Well, the water mains were all damaged. The sewer lines were ruptured. The water system was severely contaminated and it was undrinkable. So water had to be brought in for several weeks for the residents of Torrington. A few people were lucky. They had wells on their property. And if they were extra lucky, they had a hand pump. And they were able to use the hand pump to draw water from the wells. There was not electricity in Torrington, though, for several days. So most of the wells had electric pumps and they were not active. Farmers brought water into Torrington using milk cans from their farms. The rapid dairy transport located in Torrington filled their milk trucks with water and distributed water. This is a picture of water being distributed by the South School. The schools in Torrington served as distribution centers for water during the flood. Even the Narragansett Brewery got into the action and sent bottled water to Torrington as part of their flood relief efforts. So the Army Corps of Engineers was responsible for temporary housing, repairs to the water and sewer lines, cleaning debris from the river, and building temporary bridges. This is a view of the work that was accomplished to reopen the Prospect Street Bridge. The deep washouts on the south side of the bridge were filled and the bridge once again became passable. This was the first vital link to be reopened between the two halves of Torrington. The West Torrington Bridge likewise was structurally sound but needed some repair work to the approaches to the bridge. This was probably the second bridge that was reopened after the flood. The next task was one of the more daunting ones. It was to rebuild the bridge in the center. And although a permanent bridge was not rebuilt until 1959, a temporary bridge took shape on August 27th and lasted until the permanent bridge was built in 1959. This is a Bailey Bridge constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers. The Bailey Bridge was invented by British engineers in the early years of World War II and saw great use by the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, replacing river bridges that had been destroyed by bombs and bombardment. This view was taken by a photographer for Life magazine who was assigned to cover some of the recovery efforts in Torrington. This is another view taken by that photographer for Life magazine, showing the Bailey Bridge taking shape, the damage to the Central Hotel and the Workman Rollinson Company. And my favorite picture taken by that Life photographer was this picture of the bridge taken from inside the Workman Rollinson Furniture Company, looking out over the damaged furniture at the bridge taking shape. Here's a photograph of the Bailey Bridge carrying traffic across the river in the center of Torrington. You can still see there's a lot of damage from the flood visible. This was a temporary bridge being built of wood across the Naugatuck River at the East Albert Street crossing. The Army Corps of Engineers was very worried about all the debris that was blocking the river. They were especially worried that if another rain event occurred, that some severe flooding could occur once again if the river channel was not cleared of debris. They gave a contract to O&G Industries to begin the work of clearing the debris from the river. And that's what you see here. This is along Franklin Street, an O&G shovel at work, picking up the remains of Center Bridge and anything else that had washed into the river and settled there. This is a view looking down Franklin Street during the cleanup. It's another O&G piece of equipment over here at work, and probably one over here as well. One of the, I think the worst tasks of cleanup was getting the mud out of the basements and first floors of all the buildings and factories in Torrington. Here you can see a bunch of workers cleaning what looks like a factory building. This is a view inside the American Brass Company showing river silt in what looks like drifts on the floor of the factory. And you can be sure that that fine river silt wreaked havoc with all of the machinery in the factory. This was a major employer in Torrington, and this part of the mill was probably out of service for quite a long time, although other parts of the factory went into production by September 1st. The basements of all the stores along Main Street, Lower Main Street and East Main Street were essentially swimming pools filled with water, and the fire department helped pump out those basements. What was left behind was an absolute mess of mud and merchandise. Jim Miller captured this view during the recovery operations. It's very ironic photograph. It shows a man with a sledgehammer breaking down a wall that was damaged in the flood, but above him is an older sign that says, "Notice, any person caught damaging property will be prosecuted by law." The stores and restaurants along East Main Street were flooded to the second floor level. Everything on the first floor and in the basements of all these buildings had to be cleaned out and thrown away. They brought a bulldozer into the First National store on East Main Street and pushed the entire contents of the store out into the street so it could be picked up and carted away. And this, no doubt, is a picture of what was remaining of the stock of crackers from the A&P store. Needless to say, they were a bit soggy by this time. Another Jim Miller photograph, one of my favorites. This shows that one person's loss was another person's gain during the flood. This young lad is looking at some of the flood debris placed outside one of the retail stores. I believe this is the Lyford Hardware store on East Main Street. And he's surveying what remains of some wagons, probably looking for parts that he could salvage for some project that he has in mind. It's a photograph Jim Miller took of supplies coming to rebuild the gas and water lines in Torrington. Buildings that were damaged were demolished. All told, the flood damage in Torrington amounted to $13 million. In 2021, that would be $143 million worth of damage. And as I said earlier, the brass mill sustained $5 million worth of damage. And that amount in 2021 would be $55 million. There were 20 homes destroyed, 650 heavily damaged, 400 lightly damaged, and 7 lives lost. Some milestones on the road to recovery. By August 26th, the first newspaper was published. This was just a week after the flood. 95% of the electricity was restored. The debris was cleaned up in the center of town. The curfew was lifted, and some water service was restored to parts of Torrington. A couple days later, the Bailey Bridge on Main Street opened, and by September 1st, all of the industries in town were at least partially open. And then a little bit later, in early September, gas and water were restored. When Jim Miller published a book of his photographs about a month or so after the flood, he included this picture of a pretty busy scene in downtown Torrington, showing traffic flowing through the center over the temporary Bailey Bridge. And Jim Miller wrote, "At last, something akin to normalcy begins to show through. Temporary bridges are in place, streets are passable, people begin to venture out, to shop for necessities, to begin to live again a little." The final and most exciting chapter of the story is yet to be written. And I think what Jim had in mind, of course, was the rebuilding and recovery that would take place in Torrington shortly. The first step to that recovery, though, was protecting Torrington from future floods. And Aubrey Parkman of Tufts University, in writing about the flood many years later, said that Hurricane Diane swept away the complacent attitude toward flood control as much as it swept away lives and property. So there was talk about flood control before the 55 flood, but it was a daunting task and an expensive one, and not much progress was made, even though there were a lot of conversations with state officials about what could be done here in Torrington to protect the municipality better. However, after the flood of 55, it was obvious that something had to be done. If not only to protect the merchants in downtown Torrington, but the residential neighborhoods along the river, and also the industries, because at this time, the industries along the river in Torrington were still very important defense industries for this nation. And the federal government had an interest in protecting those industries. In 1957, the city of Torrington, the residents of the city approved $1.7 million in municipal bonding to begin flood control efforts. 2 years later, the Army Corps of Engineers completed the local protection along the east branch of the river. This included widening the river channel, deepening it, and rebuilding the banks on either side of the river. In 1959, the new center bridge was constructed. The Army Corps completed local protection on the west branch in 1960. And 2 years later, the Army Corps completed Hall Meadow Dam on the Norfolk Road, and 2 years after that, in 64, the East Branch Dam in the Newfield section of Torrington. The flood control project along the East Branch was historic because it was the first flood control project to be built under the Bush-McCormick Act. It was an amendment to the Federal Flood Control Act, and it authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to spend up to $400,000 on flood control projects without congressional approval. The act was sponsored by Prescott Bush, a U.S. Senator from Connecticut and father of George H. Bush, grandfather of George W. Bush. This is what the west branch of the river looked like after the flood control, the local flood control project was completed there. The river channel was deepened, widened, and stones or riprap was placed along the banks of the river to protect from erosion during high water. This is an aerial view showing the new center bridge built in 1959, the channelized river, west branch of the river and east branch of the river, and a new bridge that was built to connect Oak Avenue to Franklin Street, not Franklin Street, Franklin Drive, excuse me. This view also shows a neighborhood just east of Cole Park. This was a very active neighborhood after the flood of 55. And a lot of people think that this neighborhood was destroyed in the flood of 55. It was not. It was destroyed, however, during redevelopment and urban renewal in the early 1960s to build an automobile-centered shopping center, which is the Torrington Plaza, located just on South Main Street. But this also gives a good view of the river protection here along the east branch of the river. The next part of the story is best summed up by Major General Fleming of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at the dedication of the East Branch Dam in 1964. He said that Hurricane Diane did as much damage in the Naugatuck Valley as 3 years of warfare had done to the Ruhr Valley in Germany during World War II. He also estimated that the flood control dams built by the Army Corps in the Naugatuck River Valley would cut future flood losses by 70 to 80%. And here's some statistics. The East Branch Dam has a watershed of 9 square miles, and it can store almost 9 inches of rainfall over that watershed. The Palmetto Dam has a watershed almost twice as big, 17 square miles, and it also can store about 9 inches of rainfall over that 17 square mile watershed. But flood control dams did not come without a price, not only financial, but this neighborhood, this farm and neighborhood located behind the East Branch Dam had to be cleared because this area would be flooded every time the flood control dam was closed to catch rainfall. So this is the Sunnybrook Farm in the foreground and some of the houses along the Newfield Road. All of these people were relocated to other parts of Torrington, some to higher ground just up here on the hillside above what's now Sunnybrook Park. As I said earlier, Jim Miller helped fund an environmental organization in Torrington called Pride. And one of the early projects of Pride was to work with the Army Corps of Engineers to get permission to build a low dam of rocks held in place by wire cages across the Naugatuck River. That work was done by the National Guard. And this shows the dam when it was completed. This shows the pool of water that was created in the river by that dam, sort of a reflecting pool to make the river a little more interesting, create a little beauty along the river. This picture shows quite clearly, though, that industrialization along the Naugatuck River and the flood control efforts did have an effect on the aesthetics of the river as it flowed through downtown Torrington. As that becomes really clear when you look at this view, the next view, which shows the river 70 years before the picture that you're currently looking at. This is a view of the river about 1900. It shows the riverbank very close to the water itself. You can see why this river was prone to flooding. But it also shows that the river was a green corridor through the center of Torrington. And it is my personal hope that in the decades to come, that some accommodation can be made to introduce more greenery along the river in Torrington without sacrificing the good work accomplished by the flood control projects. It's obvious that the flood of '55 was a tragic event. I hope you also see that it brought out the best in everyone here in Torrington. The people of Torrington worked together to protect one another during the flood, to care for one another after the flood, and to rebuild their shattered community. Bradford Cadmus, a local resident, sums it up eloquently when he wrote, "The spirit of everyone is amazing. All are hard at work, digging out, patching up, and getting things working again. It makes one proud to be a human being." And that is the end of my program. I'm going to stop the screen sharing. And I would like to say, I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. And I think Sue might be able to orchestrate a few questions from our audience.
Right. So we have one question in chat, and if people have questions, they can put them into chat right now, or we can open up the lines in just a minute. But somebody had a question about, is the flood line still shown in Howard's? Do we know if that flood line is still there, the flood mark?
In Howard's building?
In Howard's building.
I don't know. I mean, for a long time, it was visible in the auditorium of the Warner Theater, but I don't know if it was preserved during the renovations of the Warner about 15 plus years ago. There used to be a high water mark in Tosi Tire on East Main Street. They had a plaque on the wall that showed the high water mark. Now that still may be there. I'm not sure about that. I know for a fact that the high water mark is not visible on the wall of Petricone's Pharmacy anymore, because I went down there to look and it's gone. Because they built a new building there on the corner instead of the gas station. So they covered up that wall.
Great. Was the Central Hotel ever restored somewhere else?
No, it was demolished.
Okay. A lot of people are liking the views of the center afterwards with the parkade and looking at the sides of the river, seeing what things look like.
Mhm. Yeah, those aerial views are very interesting.
Yep, let me just go through. Great comments here. Was some of the lumber problems also from the Torrington Lumber Company?
The Torrington Lumber Company at that time was in the north end of Torrington. It was on Farley Place. And I don't know if any of that lumber got washed down the East Branch of the river. That's a really good question. I can't answer that. But that would have gone down the East Branch of the river, not the West Branch.
Okay, there is a comment that there is a high water mark at the Drakeville Firehouse.
Oh, interesting. I wonder how high it is above ground level.
Someone wants to know, did they bring in outhouses?
Good question. Once again, I don't think they had invented the portalet yet at that time. So I'm not sure. I think people who had some facilities might have shared them with their neighbors.
And the last question we have in chat is, were any Torrington graves disturbed?
Another good question, and one that I am not prepared to answer. I know that the floodwaters came very close to St. Francis Cemetery in the south end, what's called New St. Francis Cemetery. So I don't know if any graves were disturbed there. It's possible, though. Have to look into that.
It's hard to stump Mark on questions about Torrington, so these are great questions, everyone. Thank you. Does anybody on the line have any presentations that they want to unmute themselves and ask? We've got time for one or two more, and that's it.
This is Greg Mealy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Greg.
Mark, just a quick comment on your jar of sediment that was recovered.
Yes.
Years back, I was doing maintenance at the Warner Theater on the footlight assemblies, reworking sockets and so forth. When those were taken apart, the assemblies were caked solid with dirt from the sediment that had settled into those back in the day.
Yeah, that was, where were those lights located again?
They're in they were footlights on the stage. They would kick up and light the feet area, so to speak, right at the front edge of the stage.
Yeah, the water was, at that point in the theater, the water was probably several feet above the stage, I would think.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, that silt ended up everywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if we could still find some today in a few places.
Probably. And just a quick note too, my cousin John Mealy was a firefighter back in the day. He had a jar of water that he had saved for years that had a label on it from the 55 flood.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
It's holy water.
Yeah, pretty much. So, thanks again for a great presentation, Mark. As always, you guys are awesome. You and Gail and the rest of the crew. Thanks
for joining us.
Thank you. One more question? Okay, I think we're done for tonight. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have one more program in Torrington Talks coming up on June 16th. Gail will be giving a presentation on what's in a name, the history of Torrington Street. So we hope to see you there. And if not, hopefully at one of our summer programs. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, and we'll see y'all soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Great job.
Presentation.
Great job.
Excellent.